Hirna dal nífa corfuing chun sin stúr ina gnífa agus náart a grasna a brona or in chuní de bhórt chun crían. Andas go rútsa a sófar an a bríthar agus in the ligní festa agus go tríd a creek no free three pre-star day. Directly deceased your Lord our actions by the holy inspirations and carry them on by thy gracious assistance. Every word and work of ours may always begin from thee and by thee. Be happily ended through Christ our Lord. Leaders' questions. I call on Deputy Micheál Martin. You have 2 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, some time ago, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, Brendan Howland, today announced that he was going to, in essence, effect a transformation of the whole system of allowances within the public sector, and he said that he wanted to get savings of 75 million this year and 150 million next year. And there's no question that this was one of the big ideas of the new Department of Public Expenditure. But yesterday, and if you analyse any of the commentators this morning, the Minister had to announce a humiliating climb down, a cave-in, a huge retreat from his opening position. And the headlines were quite significant at that time in terms of the transformation that was about to happen and so forth. Now, he was adamant that he was going to achieve a fairly modest target of 75 million, let's be honest, which I think was less than 5%. So you're looking at 75 million out of 1.5 billion. Now, in the end, the Minister has only been in a position to actually make one change in the allowances. One allowance is changed out of 1,100 allowances. It's abolished. 1 out of 1,100. Now, it's an extraordinary outcome of a very lengthy examination from a new upcoming department that was meant to really cut with a swathe through relics of the past. And let's be honest, some of these allowances are relics. They belong to a different era. And the context, Taoiseach, in all of this, I want to ask, how did the Minister get into this scenario, leading people up the hill and back down again? And I would ask you to outline the reasoning and the rationale behind the Minister's endeavours. I mean, you're involved here in terms of bus allowances of 440, where car parking spaces are provided. There's many more examples. They're across the board. And I would have to say, Taoiseach, we can't forever go at new entrants to professions. We can't just believe that all the savings have to be targeted at new entrants. That's going to create its own problems down the line.
Thank you, David.
So I had to ask Taoiseach, what's the rationale for the Minister's about turn in relation to this?
Thank you. Taoiseach, 3 minutes.
Well, clearly the Croke Park Agreement has been in situ for some time. It's delivered in the sense of industrial peace, a significant reduction in the numbers working in the public sector and a significant reduction in the cost of the public sector. Now, clearly, government have set itself on a path here to meet the budgetary targets that we have to meet, which minimises the need for cutbacks to frontline public services. Government have to meet our budgetary targets in a way that minimises cuts to frontline services and frontline public services. And that means that we have to achieve the maximum possible savings in order to that do not impact upon services as a consequence. Now, last week I instructed every minister to respond both to the Minister for Public Expenditure and to myself in respect of their best assessment of what is the maximum that can be squeezed from the Croke Park Agreement, which we would like to see implemented in full in an accelerated fashion. Now, that analysis by each minister will be returned to me this week. When I have that assessed along with Minister Howland, what I intend to do is to convene a meeting of the Croke Park Agreement implementation body and present that outcome to managers and unions. So yesterday's government decision and announcement by Minister Howland, in which he was honest enough to say that the target that was an indicative target of 75 million would not be met, is the first step. Is the first step to dealing with the question of what is the maximum can be squeezed from the Croke Park Agreement. Because the other side of that equation is that you impact upon frontline public services, and as you're well aware, of the difficulties that are imposed in that. So all other issues are to be dealt with as this part of the assessment of ministers and consideration of that outcome by the unions and the management of the implementation body. And I intend to call that meeting when the instruction given last week at the Cabinet is actually before us. So Minister Howland's announcement yesterday was in respect of new entrants. He's already pointed out that while one was abolished, 180 categories are to be changed and 200 others are to be reviewed.
Thank you.
Taoiseach, and I'm trying to be, constructive here, but that's a fairly pathetic response, really, to the situation. I mean, a letter last week. What have ministers been doing for months in relation to Croke Park? Everybody was under the view that people were endeavouring to achieve and realise as much savings as possible over the last 18 months.
Deputy Martin is well able to handle himself. Doesn't need any help, thanks.
For the last week to say I've issued a letter and an instruction is a rather pathetic response. But the real point I'm saying, Taoiseach, the announcement yesterday was that in terms of squeezing more out of Croke Park is about 3 million out of 1.5 billion. Now, Taoiseach, the Fiscal Council report, which you dismissed more or less in your initial comments, paints a very difficult picture and challenging picture for everybody in society and in government in terms of the challenges, concerns over growth rates and its impact on deficit reduction, concerns over our capacity to effect the deficit targets that we wish to do, and concerns also in terms of rising unemployment. Well, Taoiseach, there are very serious issues here, and you spoke about frontline services. Frontline services are being cut, Taoiseach. And it's about social solidarity. We're talking here about some relics and some outdated allowances, while at the same time home help allowances are being cut. Thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of hours being cut. And right across the board, people with disabilities, as we found out only a month ago, were being cut savagely. So what I'm trying to say, Taoiseach, is there's a need, particularly in the context of the Fiscal Council report,
can we have the question,
invoke clause 128 of the Croke Park Agreement to get people around the table and say that this isn't a realistic outcome of a fairly serious issue in terms of a 1.5 billion pot and 3 million is the outcome. Surely that lack of success or any sense of achievement or realisation of savings is justification in itself for invoking clause 128 to convene a serious substantive meeting of everybody to get them around the table on an issue like this. And do you intend to do that?
Well, yes, under the existing structure of the implementation of Croke Park, the cost of the public pay bill has been reduced by 2.1 billion, and the numbers are down by 28,000 fewer to actually doing more work. Now, last year, 1.4 billion was paid in allowances and premiums. Like, if you want,
sorry, could we have a reply to the question?
The point is, Deputy Martin, I've already said to you in reply to your first question that when the best assessment of the ministers on government instruction of last week come in this week, it's my intention to call a meeting of the Croke Park implementation group, unions and management, and present the outcome of that analysis to them. Because we're interested in implementation of the Croke Park Agreement in full, in accelerated a fashion as we can. And that means that you've got to look at all of the best and maximum assessment of what are the maximum savings that we can get from the Croke Park Agreement to minimise potential cuts in public services.
Thank you.
That's the equation. We've exceeded our deficit targets this year. We've exceeded our deficit targets last year. And in regard to the Fiscal Advisory Council, that's an independent body. It's perfectly entitled to put forward its reports. It's perfectly entitled to make its assessments of what should be done. And as I said yesterday in reply to questions from other deputies, that will be the subject of a debate here in the House, where people can put forward their suggestions and their views as to how we deal with this very challenging position. Does anybody in the House think that it's with any degree of pleasure that any minister would have to stand up and say, I am forced, because of a particular position, to have to reduce a frontline service? That's why, Deputy Martin, it's necessary now that we look at the maximum savings that we can get from Croke Park and squeeze that to the ultimate in order to minimise any potential impact on frontline services.
Thank you.
Now, do that as soon as we have the assessments of ministers and present that outcome to the implementation.